Hey guys, it's Sheri Vegas and welcome back to my channel. So today I'm going to answer the top 5 questions that I always get asked with resin art. So I'm more than happy to answer anyone's questions that they have about resin art or any art form to the best of my ability. So you're more than welcome to send me messages on my Instagram, which is just Sheri Vegas, or on my Facebook page, which is Sheri Vegas Abstract Artist. I'm always happy to answer them. But in this little video, I thought I would do the top 5, so hopefully these help you guys out. So the number one question that I always get asked is, what are the best colors to use in my resin? So like, what are the best colorants, inks, tints, pigments, powders? What can I use to color my resin? For artwork or for bangles or for whatever you're using, I always recommend to use the brand their colors that come with the resin. So if you're using Just Resin or Art Resin or U Resin or the gazillion brands of resin that are out there, they always generally have their own line of colorants. So I always recommend using those with the resin because you know that they're going to work and they're designed to work with the resin, so you're not going to have any little surprises where the resin doesn't set properly, or the color's not correct, or it's not opaque enough, or it's too tinted, or the colors change and they're not what you thought they would be. So I always recommend just buying the correct resins to go. But with your epoxy-based resins, you can use other mediums. So you can use acrylic paints, you can use alcohol inks, you can use inks, and you can also use pigments, powders, whatever you want in them. But you're not always going to get the best result from them. So I always recommend just using what is made and manufactured for the resin, because you don't want your resin not to set because the paint that you used is stopping it from setting because it's got too much moisture in it, or that the colors have all changed, or you know, it's turned really gluggy and you've not been able to use that resin and you've just wasted all that resin that you've just colored. So the second question that I get asked is about measuring the resin. So if you've worked with resin before, you know you need to get your measurements really exact. Because if you've got too much of part A or too much of part B, it will stop your resin from setting, or your resin will set way too fast. And either one you don't want. So some resins, yes, you can measure by the weight of the resin. So you can go, okay, that's 1.5 of this and that's 1.5 of that, I've got the same amount. But I always recommend, and most of the manufacturers always recommend, that you measure by volume. So you measure by milliliters or liters or however much of resin you're using. The reason why is, unless you're both part A and part B have the same density, so they weigh the same amount for the same amount, your measurements are going to be off. So if you're using a casting resin, and so your casting resin's generally, the part B is liquidy and really thin and runny, and your part A is super thick. So obviously they don't have the same density, so they're not going to weigh the same. So you need to know that both part A and part B weigh the same. So they're not the same amount, but they weigh the same if you want to use them by measurements, by using a scale and measuring your resin that way. But generally, I always recommend measuring jugs, and just that's the way you know you've got the exact same amounts. Another question that I always get asked is choosing the right resin for the right job. So I work with a few different types of resin because I do a few different things. So I do a lot of art resin boards. I also do a lot of casting, so I cast flowers. And I also do, like, I make my own plates and homewares from resin. So I have to use a few different types of resin for the different job. So the 3 main resins are your polyester, your polyurethane, and your epoxy. Generally, your epoxy resin can work for most jobs, and it's also the easiest to use. And then you've got your polyester, which isn't the best. I would not recommend it for beginners, but it is great for casting. And then you've got your polyurethane, which is kind of like in the middle, but can be used for a few things, can't be used for other things. I've got a full in-depth talk that I have done, so I'll put that link down, and it explains the difference between the 3 resins and what each resin you can use for what job. So the fourth question, and this is a really common question, is why did my resin not cure? It could be for a few reasons. So one of the main reasons is you did not mix even ratios. So if you were actually using scales to weigh out your resin and they weren't the same densities, then you're not going to have the right measurements. So by not having the exact even ratios, depending on whether it's a 1-to-1 or a 1-to-2, will really affect how your resin sets. And once you've done that, there's no saving that. That resin is basically, you might as well chuck it out if you didn't measure it correctly to begin with. Also, the heat. If it's too cold, it's too hot, you need to have your room quite like room temperature. So I think it's 22 to 25 Celsius is really great ideal temperature to work with resin. And also if you've used the wrong mixatives or additives, so to create really cool effects in your resin, you can add Resi Blast, you could add pure alcohol, you can add acetone, but if you use too much of those things, it can actually stop the chemical reaction with the part A and part B from happening and can stop your resin from setting and curing. And the last and final question that I'm going to be covering in this tutorial is adding items to resin. So this has become very popular, and yes, you can add multiple items to resin, but there are a few steps that you need to do before adding those items. So you can't add anything with moisture. So if you wanted to put flowers in resin, you actually have to dry those flowers first and then treat them properly before you can use them in resin. Anything with moisture will stop that resin from setting. So you can't put a fresh flower in resin. You couldn't put like anything, just anything that's wet or has moisture to it cannot be set in resin. It will stop the resin from setting. And if you are using dried flowers, you do need to seal them first to stop any air bubbles. So you can put multiple different things in resin. You could put little toy cars. Obviously flowers are a big one. You could put beads if you're making a bangle. There's so much you can add into resin, but it just can't have any moisture to it. So thank you guys for watching my 5 most common questions that I get asked. If you like this and you found the information really helpful, make sure you give it a big thumbs up, as it really does help me out deciding on what content I should make for you guys. And if you're new to my channel, make sure to subscribe, and also find me on my other social medias, Sheri Vegas, and I will answer any other questions that you have. Thank you.